I'd like to start off this video by issuing a blanket apology to you, my viewers, and to YouTube and to Google for misleading you, for abusing your trust, for spreading falsehoods and lies. I'm sorry, and I've removed all the offensive content that I could find that violate the terms of service. And if I find any stuff I missed, I will remove it in future. I will also be deleting any comments that violate YouTube's policies. So, as you may or may not know, a couple weeks back, I got a community guidelines strike because I talked about the American election. The video was posted in February of 2021, and it alleged some misinformation, and so it had to be taken down, and I be given a strike. So, in order for this to not happen in the future, and so that you personally, when you're watching YouTube videos, you know what to look for and you know when someone is trying to deceive you and that you can correct me and let me know when I'm stepping out of line. Let's go through these policies together. Because a lot of things are covered under election misinformation that I wouldn't have thought of. It's probably because of historical illiteracy on my part. It might also be that English is my first language, and that I assume when a company puts out an official policy document, somebody bothered to proofread it and it says what they mean it to say. But I'm just going to assume that that is correct. And I'm going to follow the letter of the law because I don't want to spread misinformation about the election misinformation policies. So we're just going to read this through pure, plain and clear English. So, election misinformation policies. Certain types of misleading or deceptive content with serious risk of egregious harm are not allowed on YouTube. This includes certain types of misinformation that can cause real world harm, like certain types of technically manipulated content and content interfering with the democratic process. And they're encouraging you, and I encourage you as well, if you see anybody violating any of the things we're about to talk about, that you report them and that you quote the policy directly. Because we have to work together to get these lies off of the internet. So if you're posting content, these policies prohibit certain types of content relating to free and fair democratic elections. Don't post election related content if it fits any of the descriptions below. Voter suppression, candidate eligibility. So it doesn't really specify which election, if it's referring to the past, present, or future. Later on, it gives an indication. So I guess if you post any content about this from a historical perspective, that would also count. So if you talk about how something happened historically, I guess that would also count. I find this one interesting. Content that advocates false claims related to the technical eligibility requirements for current political candidates and sitting elected government officials to serve. Okay, I guess that's current. Okay. Um, I guess it says there, and they just mix the different tenses up. Okay. Content that contains hacked info, the disclosure of which may interfere with democratic processes. Now, I don't know exactly what hacked materials means. Does that just mean physical, like computer hacking? Does that include wiretapping? Does that include stuff like Watergate, where they like recorded stuff and they went into Nixon's personal files? Because wouldn't posting any of the stuff that was revealed during Watergate technically violate the spirit of that law? I don't know, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, here's the big one. Here's one that I was kind of surprised by this, but once again, I might just suffer from having spoken English as my first language. Election integrity. Content advancing false claims that widespread fraud, error, or glitches occurred in certain past elections to determine heads of government. Or content that claims that the certified results of those elections was false. This policy currently applies to any past U.S. election, the 2021 German federal election, and the past couple previous Brazilian elections, including the one that Bolsonaro won. So I guess that's kind of balanced. It's not a complete list, though. We can only give 3 examples. So I'm just gonna. The thing that kind of got me was the whole any. So let's look at what the dictionary definition of any is. Used to refer to one or some of a thing or a number of things, no matter how many. I don't have any choice. Okay, one or some of a thing or number of things, no matter how many. So that would seem to refer to all past US elections. So the official position on YouTube is there has not been any major fraud in any previous US presidential election, going back to the founding of the country. Now, I'm just reading what they put down. It doesn't say the 2020, 2016 presidential election. It says all US presidential elections. So any content that alleges that Bush won the 2000 election because of the Supreme Court or through voter fraud in Florida is a violation of this and should probably be reported. What I find really interesting about this, and this is a position that I didn't think YouTube would take, is the idea that there was no electoral fraud in the South during the post-Civil War era. So let's go through a couple elections. So during the election of 1864, which was Lincoln against McClellan, most of the southern states were seceded at the moment and were not able to vote in the election. So according to this would mean there was no fraud and that the certified results of this, I guess the states not being allowed to vote doesn't technically count as fraud, maybe? So that happened. And then that happened in like the subsequent presidential elections where certain states were not allowed to participate. You also had the scenario in which the claim is that white Southerners were not allowed to vote and that only people from the North who moved south or freed slaves in the South were allowed to vote. And that's the reason why the Republicans won presidential elections. That didn't happen in accordance with this. Let's look at this again. Claims that there are widespread fraud. There was no widespread fraud during this election, and it did not impact the results. I think YouTube lies about this. Yeah, they're claiming that there was like fraud. And it's the thing that kind of confuses me is YouTube on my video about Emperor Palpatine told me that to go to a Wikipedia article about how the Q boomer conspiracy wasn't real. So they're directing me towards a source that says there was election fraud. So I don't know. I'm kind of confused here. 1872, we have another thing where I think there's allegations. Yeah, there is fraudulent allegations there because once again, you have these insane conspiracy theorists that militarily occupying southern states was in some way impacting the results of the election. I think Tilden now polled Hayes. There was wide allegations of electoral fraud, electoral violence, and other disfranchisement of predominantly Republican black voters. I mean, that's not true. There was no electoral disenfranchisement. Because once again, that there was widespread fraud, errors, or glitches in any past U.S. election. So in the post-Civil War era, there was no disenfranchised blacks in the South. I'm just going with what YouTube said. The history books I read indicated something else. I think a lot of liberal YouTube channels that assert that there was fraud in the South until the Civil Rights Act in the 60s probably need to be reported for going against the YouTube terms of service. So there's claims that that election was fraudulent. There's claims that this one was fraudulent. I think there's claims that most of the post-Civil War ones, let's see here. There's Grover Cleveland. And another conspiracy theory you see is this idea of something called Tammany Hall, which is this allegation that there was a Democratic political machine in the city of New York that engaged in massive electoral fraud. And that was the reason in some of these elections where the Republicans carried most of the Northeast instead of it. And that obviously didn't happen. Now, I'm not sure if head of government also applies to gubernatorial elections. But like I said, according to this, that didn't happen. There was no electoral fraud. Actually, any Martin Luther King Jr. speech, like the one where he said the black man in the South can't vote and the black man in the North has nothing to vote for, should probably be flagged for violating election misinformation law. Because that's advocating that there was widespread fraud, errors, or glitches in certain past elections to determine heads of government, which is any past U.S. presidential election. So there's the 2021 German federal election. So I guess that's the only one that there was no fraud during whatsoever. Okay, that's good to keep in mind. There's the election Bolsonaro legitimately won. It was interesting. I think it said this before the election even happened. So that's how good YouTube is. They knew that there was not going to be any issues with an election before it even happened. Examples of content not allowed on YouTube. Telling voters they can vote through inaccurate methods like texting their vote to a particular number. Polls claim that non-citizen voting has determined the outcome of past elections. False claims that Brazilian electronic voting machines have been hacked in the past to change an individual's vote. So that's any case. Now, as someone who speaks English as my first language, have been hacked in the past, would that include like when they were being tested? So like I assume the company that made them had like white hat hackers to try to hack into them to make sure they work properly. So would saying that they did that testing be a violation of the election misinformation laws? I YouTube, I'm happy to hear that. Claims that a candidate or sitting government official. Okay, so claims that a candidate or sitting government official is not eligible to hold office based on false info about age, based on false info about citizenship status to hold office in that country region. I think that would also indicate that once again, if you say that like black people were not or were practically not allowed to run for office in segregation in South, on the official books, they probably were allowed to run for office. So to claim that is a form of election disinformation. Claims that a candidate or sitting government official is ineligible for office based on false claims that they're deceased, not old enough, or otherwise do not meet eligibility requirements. So the spirit of this seems to indicate that any kind of claim, and it doesn't say any there, but any claim that somebody who is in any position of power is not eligible to hold that position of power is illegitimate. So I don't know. The thing I'm getting from this is like the elections in Venezuela were legitimate. See, most countries, even countries that are allegedly considered dictatorships, have elections. China has elections. Cuba has elections. Now, conspiracy theorists might say about Cuba that there's only one legal party, and they might say that because the Cuban Constitution says that. But in reality, Cuba is a multi-party system where there is no electoral fraud and no manipulation. Same thing with Venezuela, North Korea, China. I guess this would also apply to Russia. There's no electoral fraud in Russia either. Interesting. Let's see here. Claims that telling voters to hack government websites to delay the release of election results, videos that contain hacked info about a political candidate shared with intent to interfere with an election. That includes if they committed any kind of crime. if they're a pedophile and you have evidence of it, don't share that. If anyone shares evidence to me that any elected official has committed a crime, I'm just going to ignore it. So then we have election integrity. So let's look at this. Claims that a candidate only won a swing state in the 2020 presidential election due to voting machine glitches that changed votes. So if anyone alleges that there has ever been a voting machine glitch, you're going to get banned. Claims that widespread fraud or errors occurred in any past presidential election. Once again, they use the word any multiple times. I speak English as a first language, so I'm assuming that includes the Jim Crow elections, and that includes the post-Civil War elections, and that includes the elections where women weren't allowed to vote. Claims that fake ballots were dumped to give one candidate enough votes to win a state in a past presidential election. Now, here's the one I was confused about. Content advancing claims that widespread fraud, error, or glitches changed the outcome of the German parliamentary Bundestag elections. Shouldn't it be of outcome of a German parliamentary Bundestag election? Because it sounds like there's just one election. Maybe I'm just like high or something. Outcome of the... So it says German parliamentary and then Bundestag. So I guess it means Bundestag, but that doesn't include Reichstag elections. Because they did still have elections under Nazi Germany. They had there's obviously the elections that brought Hitler to power. They also did have elections during Nazi Germany where the Nazi Party got approximately 90% of the vote. So I'm not sure that might be violating terms of service to allege that those were fake. Delegitimizes the formation of the new government or the election and appointments of the next German chancellor. So once again, I'm not entirely sure because if that means any German chancellor, because that would mean that if you question the appointment of Hitler to German chancellor, then that would be in violation of the terms of service. Remember, don't post content if you think it might violate these policies. If you have URLs to anything, that would include. So I think these are all very important things to keep in mind when you're going through it. And I think you have to just, if anybody's alleging that you violated any of these, then just make sure. If for instance, people are saying there's all these people saying that democracy's on the ballot in the upcoming midterm election. So people saying that are in violation of YouTube's terms of service because they're alleging widespread fraud and fakeness. So I mean, if you want to report that, I guess all I'm doing is just trying to be in compliance with what YouTube has told us. I solemnly swear that I will respect the terms of service going forward, and all elections are legitimate. I will not spread misinformation ever again.